and I'm a partner and director of Treasury Strategies and acting head of the technology practice. I'm joined here in Chicago today by my colleague Jeff Diorio, who's a principal in our Treasury technology practice. And this is another one in our ongoing series of quarterly briefings relating to the use of and issues with Treasury, with technology in Treasury. Just a couple of quick logistics. We will end promptly within 30 minutes. We do welcome questions on this webinar, but in order to keep to our 30-minute timeline, we'll answer them offline. So if you have a question, use the question box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and send that to us. We'll answer to everybody who's on the webinar after the session. And finally, for everyone who's on the phone and all other participants, after the presentation's over, we will send an email with a link to the recording of the session as well as the presentation slides themselves. So today, we're taking up the issue again of security and in particular cyber risks for the Treasury function. Basically, in this subject of the security of Treasury and payments information and the security of your payments processes, you need to know that you're buttoned up. Treasury needs to know where all of the Treasury and payments information is at all times and to know that it's properly guarded and secured, especially when it's not in your hands. And you need to be prepared if one of your banks experiences a denial of service event. And above all, you need to avoid having to explain to your boss and the board why your data got away from you or why you couldn't get the payments out. I think everybody agrees on that. So what we want to do today is begin methodically assessing the cyber impacts to your organization, thinking through how to define those risks and understand these exposures, and then talking about some initial steps in an action plan for dealing with them. Now, this topic is too big for this session, so we intend to have a part 2 in another 3 months at our next quarterly briefing, and we'll talk about that at the end of this webinar. We'll give you a little preview of what we're going to do then. But this is what we've got on the agenda for today. So let's get started, Jeff.
Thank you, Kathy. So what are the impacts to your organization? The attack or breach may not be focused specifically on your organization, but you will be affected. You know, we can see that over the last year, quite a number of high visibility hacks have occurred. We mentioned Target here, you'll notice JP Morgan. We know that virtual attacks have become more and more common. So one of the things that Treasury is taking advantage of is the improved technology, but as technology improves, it opens up new areas for internal and external parties to disrupt your operations or worse. We know that a certain amount of your data is vulnerable. You know, hackers like credit card data, student data, protected health information like PPI and CPI. And Treasury departments say, well, you know, we don't have much of that. But do think about this. With the advent of FBAR and some of the other reportings, there are data elements that you are at risk for divulging. And in addition, you know, it may not just be you who gets hacked, but it might be your service bureau, your vendor, your bank. So, you know, you need to be cognizant of the whole range of vulnerabilities.
So let's talk a little bit about the specific types of risk that Treasury faces.
The first is data breach. Treasurers say to us, as I mentioned before, that we don't have much sensitive data. But with FBAR and FATCA, you do have personal information. And of course, your bank account data is very critical to you. The next exposure would be denial of service. There's no question that banks are targets for many malcontents, crooks, and terrorists. So, you know, they would like to be able to take you offline, and you have to be careful about making sure you have a vulnerability plan coverage there. A side note is sometimes it's not, malfeasance. Sometimes it's an act of God that has caused an inability to conduct business through, an unavailability to reach your bank. Take for instance Hurricane Sandy or the Northeast power outage a couple of years ago. So some of the new technology helps with that because you can access these systems remotely, which is very nice. You could move someplace where you can get to them, and there you have accessibility. And finally, you have fraud or financial malfeasance, which is really where a majority of Treasury controls are focused today, around payment initiation. When we ask Treasury people, where are your exposures, a majority of them say, we have to make sure our payment stream is controlled. So, it's the most obvious area of risk, but there are others to focus on. What about your P-card program? What about your supply chain if Treasury is controlling that as well?
So Jeff, I think that those comments you just made illustrate the fact that while we have to be concerned about literal cyber risk and hacking, it's very difficult to separate out from that the risks that you also have internal to your company with just needing to protect yourself from malcontents inside the firm. So we've kind of got those two streams of security issues blended together in our thinking here. And part of that, I think, another way of looking at the issues are to think about your data in two different forms, or two different
states.
States is the right word, yes, states. We think about data at rest and data in flight. So data at rest is when it's sitting someplace. It could be on your servers, it could be at your bank, it could be at your service bureau, it could be at SWIFT. It's sitting someplace, and the questions you've got to be asking there, whether it's you or a vendor or a bank, what steps have been taken to protect from someone being able to access that payment information and change it? Is it secure from internal compromise? Do we have good admin controls? Does the bank have those controls? Does the bureau have those controls? And just incidentally, we have to think about production systems and test systems for some of these cases, because oftentimes the controls are phenomenally solid in the production system, but you still have to worry about the test system. There are things going on in the test system and different people having access to your data and your code in the test system, and that's not a point to be overlooked. Your databases that contain your data, are these controlled and encrypted? What has to happen for the encryption to happen? I know on the computers that we use at Treasury Strategies, if we just put them to sleep, nothing really goes on. If you actually shut the computer down, everything that's on the computer is immediately encrypted and solidly secured. But if you don't go through that shutdown step, all of those great processes are for naught.
And Kathy, you also need to be concerned about where your history is stored, right? Everybody has a requirement to store 7 years or more of history. You're storing history, and your vendors are storing history. So do you know where that history is stored?
And then that brings up your disaster recovery site, right? Is that as robust as your primary site? And asking those questions again for all the vendors that support you. So those are some of the things to be thinking about with data at rest. Then data in flight. What do we really mean by this? This is just our phrase for data while it's being transmitted from one place to another. So sometimes you'll hear this described as the pipe, while data is in the pipe. We want that pipe to be very secure. And we think about this being secure if it's encrypted, which is certainly almost, I would say, a requirement these days. Jeff, you have the example of the fact that we used to think data in flight was secure if your channel was HTTPS. But wasn't there an HTTPS exploit just a few months ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think everybody was shocked by that, and all the banks and counterparties that used secure channels had to update their HTTPS servers. The other one is the other example I give is Google. Google has phenomenally secure production and backup sites, but their data was intercepted as it was being sent from production to backup.
Okay, so this slide just shows some of the things we hear when we're out talking to companies and asking them how secure they think their Treasury data and information is. Hey, we know we're secure because our vendor has an SSAE 16, which, by the way, used to be the SAS 70. Oh, I can roll that off my tongue, SAS 70, but do I know what it means? We have dual authentication. We have to have 2 levels of authorization before we can make a payment. Our data is encrypted. We reset our passwords. Our passwords are very complex and therefore very secure. These are the things we hear from Treasury people, and they're all good. But the point is, these are the base level steps. So you can't stop at the base level. You have to understand where there are deficiencies or where there can be deficiencies in these, and not to be lulled into complacency simply by saying, I have these.
Absolutely, Kathy. These are the must-have base-level items. But let me give you some examples, and I think everybody in this phone call will understand them and recognize them. So one of the things is, we've done a lot of work with a lot of treasuries over the years, and probably take me about 10 minutes once I walk through the door to a cash management area to figure out where somebody's put their passwords. And it's not that they're being untrustworthy, it's necessity in a way. So, do they have them on Post-its on the side of their monitors? Are they under the keyboard? Is it a paper under the desk blotter? And you ask yourself, well, how could security be circumvented like this? Well, payments need to go out. If somebody's child gets sick and they can't make it to the office, somebody else has to release those payments. So sometimes this is just necessity. And then you say, well, now we've got 2-factor authentication. We've got a fob or a token that has a number on it that only I have. Well, invariably, somebody locks themselves out of a system. They need to get in, so they call somebody else and say, give me your login with your fob number on it, and boom, they're in. So there are ways to circumvent these securities that people need to think about and understand. You're never as secure as you think you really are. So I was at a conference the other day discussing this subject and asked for a show of hands how many people record their passwords because they can't remember them all. And 90% of the people raised their hands, and 10% of the people were in denial because they claim they didn't write them down. But we know you put them into a spreadsheet or a Word document or on a piece of paper in your wallet somewhere because there's just too many passwords to remember. I think my document, which is triple encrypted and secured and whatnot, is 4 pages long. So that's a lot of things to remember. And then also think about this. Do you have simple passwords for the things that you think don't matter, aren't high risk, and more complex passwords for the important stuff? Take, for instance, your password for Facebook versus your password for your bank login.
That paragon of information for technology security, the USA Today, a couple of days ago, had a major article about passwords being the weak link in corporate technical security. Hey, so if it's in the USA Today, it must be true. And I think this highlights the fact that we've got this basic dichotomy. The easier something is to use, probably the less secure it is. The more secure you want it to be, the more of a pain in the rear the security factors around it are going to be. And that's just something we have to be willing to deal with and get used to. If we want it to be secure, it's going to be a little bit more of a pain.
Yes, yes. So ease of use has impacted security. And let me give you an example of that, Kathy. This slide shows technological advancement in communications with your bank. I can tell you 10 years ago, we were all excited about having modems to dial up banks, and now we've moved much further along. So if you look at this, this is a description of how banks view, risk, but then we perceive ease of use. So, the direct bank connection, you've logged into the bank, the bank is able to actually verify that your PC in some cases has no malware on it. They're fairly certain of exactly who you are because you've logged into their service. But it's a direct bank connection. So if you're a Treasury with more than one bank, you've got people logging into all these different bank systems. So from an ease of use point of view, that's kind of low on the scale. Host-to-host is much better from an ease of use because we can send bulk files out. You still have a connection, hopefully a very secure and private connection between your organization and the bank, but the ease of use has moved up. However, at the same time, that file that's being sent is vulnerable if not encrypted and protected and other aspects like that. Then we get to SWIFT. And, I've been involved in this business for a long time helping companies communicate, and SWIFT is finally becoming what a lot of organizations want. It's a single point, and they connect to it, and they can communicate with all of their banks, and they love that. And the banks like it, too, because it's a single point for them to communicate with all of their clients. And SWIFT has a very good reputation of providing secure, and dependable communication of these messages. But you have to think about a few things here. Even though it's very easy to use and a lot of our clients like it for that, it's one connection. So what happens if that connection is compromised somehow? And then the other aspect of it is mobile. When you get to mobile, everybody loves mobile. I was at a conference a few weeks ago. There were a bunch of banks there, and they said their clients want more mobile, as much mobile as you can give me. There was an article. There were two articles in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about this, about Apple. One was that Apple is now getting into the payment space, and the other is that their iCloud is amenable to being hacked. And so it's kind of scary that even though it's such a new and wonderful technology, there are exploits here we're not aware of.
So Jeff, when I look at this diagram, which I think really captures the increase in risk as you move out into these more advanced services, we want to be moving in that, up to the right-hand quadrant direction. We want these new technologies deployed. We want the STP that's implied by those. We want the convenience that's implied by mobile and tablet payment services. But those imply more obligation on the part of Treasury to ask the right questions and make sure things are as locked down as they need to be. So the more we deploy these things, the more work we have to do in assuring ourselves constantly of the security.
That's a great point, Kathy.
So here we have another, wait,
oh, no.
Sorry.
Back up one.
We're on the
Thank you.
Now we're on the right page. Here we go.
So here's another example, right, Kathy? Think of all the steps that an organization and people and technology that are involved when you initiate a payment. Most people think of this process as straight-through processing. So they say, I initiate a payment now, and it goes right through to the bank, and there it is. But there really are multiple steps to the process. You may only have 2 or 3 of these steps, but each step has vulnerabilities. So it might just be your organization directly to the bank. The boxes represent organizations or places your data may stop. So you have to ask yourself, who has access to your data? Can that data be accessed remotely? Can it be breached? The arrows are examples of your data in flight. And so in the arrows, you have to ask, can your data be modified or altered in transit? Is your information in transit secure? And then finally, we think about the bank. So how do they authenticate that the sender was the sender that it should be and that nothing was altered as the message was sent? Additionally, as we've noted earlier, storage of the data at each of these locations has to be considered. Could the data be compromised at some later date? And Kathy, I think you were telling me that, one of the things is some companies go to the length of interrupting their STP to be sure that the information, the sensitive payments, the high-risk payments are validated.
Right. That's one thing we're hearing more about currently, is that even when you have a direct, secure, encrypted connection to your bank, especially when you're using bulk payments and transmitting a payment file along that secure connection. Okay, historically the ideal had been transmit it through that secure connection, get it to the bank sends it out, STP all the way, that's our goal. Now what some companies are doing is, as I call it, interrupting that STP, having the bank put that information back onto their online system where it has to be validated and released by the company, so the company can have another step to confirm that nothing happened to the file in transit.
Very good point.
Willing to give up the beauty of that STP for that extra confirmation and security.
Right, and they might just be doing that for the high-risk item.
Right. So, to just kind of recap what we've covered so far, lots of benefits, obviously, with moving upward and to the right on that graph with the arrow to the cloud, for mobile payments, for more STP. But this brings new exposures and opportunities for your information to be, to possibly be breached. And it's out of your control when it's at those other vendors. So you have to be doing the due diligence to understand what their security protocols are and investigating that yourself. You really need a methodical way of assessing these risks and then figuring out what your mitigation strategies are, what steps you're going to take if, in fact, a breach occurs at some of these points while your data is at rest or in flight. Having gone through that process, now you're going to be able to relax a little bit more and enjoy the benefits of the automation, the added flexibility and added features in these more STP-type payment systems, while knowing that you have done what you can to make sure your data is protected and carefully secured.
Great points, Kathy. The technological advancements over the last 20 years have really brought some great features to our clients, and the benefits they receive are they're spending much less time gathering data and handling data and much more time, in analysis and execution. So we really see huge benefits to our clients, while at the same time you have to be cognizant of these risks and protect against them. Let me talk about some action steps now. The first thing we want you to think about is identifying the different breakdowns where these risks can occur. So if you can break it into parts, then you can analyze the parts. And here are some examples. So think about an attack on your organization, the data within your organization, and recognize that could be both an internal or an external attack. Disgruntled employees are very common. I think everybody has met someone that was disgruntled at one point in time or another. And, we have to be protected against that. External attacks are very obvious. So it could be an attack on your organization. It could be an attack on your bank. It could be an attack on your vendor. It could be an attack on the general cloud. Or it could be an attack as the data moves, right? So you need to think about all of the different areas that you could be vulnerable and then come up with a strategy.
And I just want to say again what we said at the beginning of the session. It's not good enough to think just because I'm not dealing with credit card information, I don't really have to worry too much about this stuff. Even if you don't deal with credit card information, your payment data and payment information needs to be protected. Your bank account information needs to be protected. With the FBAR and FATCA reporting, you very likely hold in Treasury a lot more personal identifiable, PII, personal identification information than any treasurer used to think it had. And let me tell you, if that's the SVPs who are signers on those accounts and you've got their Social Security numbers and that gets exposed, you're not going to be a happy person. So Treasury has information that needs to be secured, even if it's not card data.
Very good point, Kathy. Another thing to think about is identity theft. The end game for identity theft is to get at your money. Well, treasuries have access to money.
That's where the money is. Follow the money.
Okay, so now let's talk about the action steps. Once you've identified these areas, you want to review each potential type of breakdown, and you want to come up with a plan for protecting that. So, do we have enough encryption? Maybe not. Maybe we want to add a little more. Do too many people have access to our servers, or do too many people have authorization to release wires? You know, these are things that can be corrected now once identified. But you also need to develop a response plan. You know, Target knew they were being compromised. They had the information that they were being compromised, and one of the things that came out of that was that they did not have a response plan ready to go. So even though they knew they were compromised, they didn't exactly have some kind of a strategy and tactical plan for responding to. The next item is cyber insurance. Right? There are policies to cover this kind of exposure. They've been more utilized around credit card fraud and that sort of thing, but they are available for Treasury. If you're going to look at them, be sure that they cover monetary and securities, because those aren't typically covered. So you can get a rider for this sort of thing. Encryption is typically a requirement. Some, but not all, will state, look, if it wasn't encrypted, we're not covering it. So you have to be thinking about encryption. And then another really interesting aspect of this is your cyber insurance broker will have policies and procedures to help you. If they're going to insure you, they're going to try and make sure that you have a really good grasp on what's going on and protections in place so they don't have to pay on the insurance. And finally, our point is bring in a specialist. You know, it's very hard when you're in the middle of a situation to see the forest for the trees. And you know, I have plenty of clients where they say, look how wonderful this is that I'm sending straight through processing payments, and this is working so well, and we have dual authentication. And I say to them, well, there could be a couple of places in this process where you're exposed. And so it's hard for them to see that, because they believe that just because they have dual authorization before it leaves the TMS that they're covered.
Jeff, we're also, I think, very geared to looking at our policies and procedures internally, and not necessarily so geared to asking the right questions of our service bureaus and external vendors who handle our databases and our data in process.
Right.
So this is a question that really, a lot of times it comes up when somebody's making a decision about a type of Treasury technology. So they're saying, well, do I want an installed system behind my own firewall, or do I want a SaaS system? What difference does it make if my data is in the cloud from a security point of view? That's the point in time that they ask that question. And then once they make their decision, okay, we're not gonna think about that again. And I think part of what we're saying here is that once and done probably isn't a good strategy for evaluating the security processes at your vendors and bureaus, that this maybe needs to be something that gets looked at a little more frequently.
Right. And just to recap, you start with prevention and detection, and then develop a policy or plan for how to respond when it happens.
So along that line, thinking about what we're going to do in the next session, our idea is that we will turn to the question of, okay, so maybe we're pretty locked down internally, but how about with my external vendors, the other places outside my firewall that my data may come to rest? or my data may go in flight to. So what should I be asking my service bureau? What should I be thinking about in terms of SWIFT security or security with my Treasury software vendor? We plan to have some vendors and other bureau-type provider join us on the next webinar, and we're going to put those specific questions to them. What should corporate customers be asking? What kind of vulnerabilities are there? What steps are you specifically taking to protect against your customers' information being exposed? So we hope you'll join us in another 3 months for round 2 of cybersecurity discussions. Thank you for being with us today. Again, we have several questions here that people have submitted, and we look forward to answering those offline and getting them back to you. Have a great day.